The night she stole the Alpha King's horse, Isolde of Ashvale had no plan, no provisions, and a ruined white dress. Just a black stallion who chose a creature that had thrown 6 men and survived 3 assassination attempts, standing still beneath her hands like he'd been waiting. When Seelan Darkhollow finally found her in a rain-soaked clearing, she wasn't hiding. She was kneeling in the mud, calmly dressing a stranger's wound, and when she saw him armed on horseback with 3 men at his back, she didn't run. She stepped between him and the injured girl. A lord's daughter with nothing, a king with everything, and a horse that apparently decided, without consulting either of them, that this was how the story began. But why would the most feared man in the Northern Alliance ride out before dawn, abandon his negotiations, and follow a woman he'd never met just to return a horse? Watch the full story to find out what really happened that night. The candle on the vanity had burned down to a stub. Isolde watched it in the mirror without really seeing it, watched the wax pool and slide, slow as honey in winter, while Mira's fingers worked through her hair with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times and found no joy in it tonight. "The lace sits crooked on the left side," Mira muttered. "Hold still." Isolde, hold still. The woman in the mirror held still 2 dark-haired, pale-throated, grey-blue eyes that caught the candlelight and gave nothing back. She had been told she was beautiful. She had been told this in the way one was told a horse was well-bred, appraisingly, by men who were measuring her against a price. She was 21 years old and she was being dressed like an offering. "There. Why?" Mira stepped back, tilting her head. Something in her expression went quiet. "You look." "I know." The wall to her left was thick stone, the kind that deadened sound except that it didn't, not fully, not when voices were raised with the comfortable certainty of men who had never needed to lower them. She didn't mean to listen. She simply stopped not listening. "The girl doesn't matter. The trade road through Ashvale is what I'm acquiring. But taking a wife costs less in taxes than buying the land outright." Her father's voice said nothing. She heard, quite distinctly, the sound of wine being poured. The candle guttered. The woman in the mirror did not move, but something behind her eyes went very still. The stillness of a creature that has heard the snap of a trap closing and is calculating, calmly, whether the leg is worth the freedom. Mira had gone motionless too, her hands loose at her sides, watching Isolde's face with the careful attention of someone who had served her since they were both 12 years old. "Ko," she said softly. It was not Isolde's name. It was something older, something Mira had called her since childhood, the diminutive of Coain, the old word for brave. "I need air," Isolde said. She was already moving toward the door. The stables at night smelled of hay and horse sweat, and the particular warmth of large animals breathing in the dark. Isolde had always found it steadying the way horses existed with such complete, uncomplicated presence. No politics in their bodies, no calculations behind their eyes. She counted the stalls as she walked. Habit. Her grandmother had taught her to read terrain, always know your exits, always count your steps, always mark the high ground, and Isolde had grown up doing it so naturally, she no longer noticed she was doing it. She just always knew where she was. The last stall held a horse she did not recognize. He stood apart from the noise of the other animals with a stillness that was not the stillness of a sleeping creature, but of one that was simply waiting, black from muzzle to tail, large enough that Isolde had to tip her head back to meet his eye. He watched her with the unhurried intelligence of something that had already decided whether she was worth his attention. He had apparently decided she was. She approached without thinking. His breath fogged the cold air between them. She reached up and placed her palm flat against the warm bridge of his nose. He did not flinch. "This horse doesn't belong here," said Mira from 3 feet behind her. "I can tell by the tack. That's northern ironwork on the bridle Dark Hollow style." "Yes," said Isolde. "Dark Hollow, as in Sealand Dark Hollow, as in the Alphaking of the Northern Alliance." A careful pause. "Who left his horse because the animal needed rest after the road." "Yes," said Isolde. A long pause. "Ko, what are you thinking?" Isolde looked at the black horse. The black horse looked back at her patient, grave, as though he had been expecting her, and was merely surprised it had taken her this long. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that I need to return a horse." Behind her, the long, suffering exhale of a woman who had known, the moment she saw the stable doors open, that she was going to regret this night. "My horse is in the 3rd stall," Mira said. "I'm getting her, and I am going to regret this." "Probably," Isolde agreed. She was already lifting herself onto the black horse's back. He did not throw her. He stood, patient and deliberate, while she settled her weight, and then, without any instruction from her hands or heels, he turned toward the stable doors and walked. The forest swallowed them before the first watch bell rang. Nox, she had begun calling him that without meaning to, the old word for night, because it seemed to suit him, moved through the dark with a confidence that suggested he knew exactly where he was going, and found her attempts to steer him mildly amusing. Every time she tried to angle him east toward the main road, he simply continued north. "Where's he taking us?" Mira asked from somewhere behind her. "I don't know." "Do you have money?" "A little." "Food?" "No." "A plan?" Isolde considered the question honestly. "Not as such. I want it noted that I am here entirely by choice, and that I expect to be compensated with something significant when this is over." "Noted." They rode through the dark for hours, speaking little, the forest deepening around them, until the sky was only a narrow seam of stars between the trees. Isolde's body ached with the cold and the unfamiliar exertion, but she did not turn back. The alternative to this discomfort was far worse. The alternative was standing still while men decided the shape of her life without consulting her. She had been standing still for 21 years. Dawn found them at the edge of a clearing where the ruins of a stone chapel crouched beneath an overgrown oak. A well stood nearby, and from inside came the particular weighted silence of someone asleep. Nox stopped. He turned his head toward the chapel door with the deliberate patience of someone pointing. Isolde understood, with a certainty she could not have explained, that this was where he had been taking her. Inside, an old man slept on a wooden bench wrapped in a brown habit, his gray beard spread across his chest, the face of someone who had spent decades outdoors, carved with the lines of a life spent squinting into wind. A leather satchel beside him, spilled herbs and vials and the worn tools of a healer. Nox's hoof struck the stone threshold. The old man opened his eyes. He lay still for a moment. Then he turned his head and saw the horse in the doorway, and sat upright with the speed of a much younger man. "Saints and ancestors," he breathed. The look of a man seeing something he had been told existed, but had never quite believed. Then his gaze moved to Isolde, and his expression shifted into something that was almost satisfaction. You must be the one Lady Seraphine wrote to me about. 3 months ago, nearly to the day." "I don't know who Lady Seraphine is." "You will." He pushed himself to his feet. "I'm Brother Aldwin. I served as the royal stable physician for 20 years before I took my vows. That horse belongs to Sealand Dark Hollow, the Alphaking. He has not permitted another rider in 8 years." Isolde looked at Nox. Nox looked at Isolde. "He permitted me," she said. "Yes." Aldwyn's eyes were very bright, very steady. That is rather the point. He studied her for a moment, frank and unhurried. When you meet his master, and you will, girl, there's no avoiding it now, remember this. He will offer you a choice. Don't refuse him the first time. The morning air moved through the ruined chapel, cold and smelling of pine resin and turned earth. Isolde turned the words over in her mind. Can you tell me more than that? No. What I know, I've told you. He smiled slightly. The rest is yours to discover. Behind her, Mira made the sound she made when she was recalculating her opinion of a situation. So, the horse of the Alphaking rode her out of Ashvale in the middle of the night, and now, a hermit is giving her advice. Not a prophecy, Aldwyn corrected mildly. Advice. Prophecy is when you can't change what's coming. Advice is when you still can. Isolde looked at Mira. Mira looked at Isolde. We could still run, Mira said. East, cross the Veld border before. On the Alphaking's horse, Isolde said. How far do you think we'd get? Mira's mouth opened. Closed. That is a fair point. We found the king. We return the horse with a full explanation. We ask for protection under the Alliance Charter. Isolde straightened her shoulders inside the white dress, wrinkled now, hem darkened with dew and forest soil. And we do not, under any circumstances, get ourselves killed. High aspirations, said Mira. I like it. The guard knocked on the chamber door at first light, while Seelan was still holding a razor to his jaw. He finished the stroke before he acknowledged the knock. His reflection in the polished bronze looked back at him, the same face it always was, useful mostly as a surface for reading the quality of his own composure. He had learned to use it that way when he was 19, and newly crowned, and every lord in the Northern Alliance was watching him for signs of weakness. Enter, he said. The guard entered young, flushed, standing very straight in the way that young soldiers did when they hoped posture would substitute for courage. The horse, my lord. Knox. He was. Gone, Seelan said. He rinsed the razor. From the Ashvale stables. Yes, my lord. And it appears he allowed someone to ride him out. The razor stilled in his hand. He had owned Knox since the horse was 4 years old, had broken him in the old way, the northern way, which was not breaking at all but a long patient negotiation between two stubborn natures. In 8 years, Knox had thrown 6 men who'd attempted to mount him without permission, and stood impassive through 3 assassination attempts and 1 thunderstorm that had reduced veteran war horses to trembling wreckage. He allowed someone to ride him. Who? Unknown, my lord. A woman, the stable boys think by the footprints. 2 riders, left before midnight. Seelan set the razor down. From the window seat his brother uncurled himself with the unhurried ease of a man who had learned that patience was the most effective form of mischief. A woman rode Knox, Dorian said, and there was something in his voice Seelan recognized as genuine delight. Out of Ashvale in the middle of the night. He paused. I want to meet her. You're not coming, Seelan said. Of course not. I just happened to be riding north this morning. Seelan looked at him flatly. Dorian looked back with the open expression of a man who had everything to hide and was enjoying the ambiguity enormously. Sir Brennan appeared in the doorway. 35, broad across the shoulders, with a scar that ran from cheekbone to jaw, not ugly, merely informative. It told you he had been in the kind of situations where such things happened and had not allowed them to stop him. The Lord of Ashvale is still in residence, Brennan said. He's expecting the continuation of the border negotiations this morning. Let him interpret my absence however he chooses. Seelan was already moving toward the wardrobe. Saddle Gareth's horse. Tell him he's coming. Gareth is 60 years old. He's the only man in this keep who's ever tracked a soul across the grey wood in winter and found what he was looking for. A pause. You're coming too. Brennan's jaw did the thing it did when he was revising an objection into a form that would land better. Seelan pulled on his coat and thought about a horse that had led a stranger onto its back, a horse that in 8 years had never done anything so unexpected. His father had told him once, in the way his father said things that were important quietly, and only once. Knox will know before you do. Trust what he chooses. He had filed this away with the rest of the things his father had said that he hadn't understood until much later. He allowed someone to ride him. He pulled on his gloves and went to find out who. The rain began an hour north of Greywood. It came in quietly, the way northern rain did, not dramatic but inexorable, softening the light until the forest existed only in shades of grey and silver. Seelan rode with his hood down. Old Gareth led them, bent low over his horse's neck, reading the mud. He raised one hand twice in the first mile, pausing, consulting some private language between ground and eye, before angling them north-northwest with the certainty of a man who had stopped doubting his own instincts long ago. Tracks go north, he said at one point, which was nearly a speech for Gareth. Not easy, not toward Veld, north, which is either very stupid or very deliberate. They found her in a clearing where a fallen oak had created a small natural shelter from the rain. She was kneeling in the mud without apparent concern for the white dress she was wearing, expensive once, thoroughly ruined now, her hands moving with quiet efficiency over the arm of a girl sitting against the fallen trunk, with the tight, controlled expression of someone managing pain. The wound was not severe. A branch had opened a long, shallow cut along the forearm. But the swelling, the dull flush of a cut left too long and cold and wet, Seelan had enough battlefield experience to recognize the early signs of infection. The woman in the white dress apparently recognized them too. She had torn fabric from her hem and was applying it in careful layers, pressing the wound's edges closed with a precision that spoke of practice. She had not heard them approach. Seelan stopped his horse at the clearing's edge and did not speak. The girl with the injured arm opened her eyes. Saw him. "Ko," she said softly. "Man on horseback. Behind you." The woman in the white dress did not startle. She did not freeze or scramble. She set one more fold of cloth in place with the unhurried care of someone who understood that a half-finished task was worse than no task at all. And then she stood. She turned. She was not tall. Her hair had come undone somewhere in the forest, black and damp against the ruined white, and her eyes, when they found him, were the color of sea glass in winter, gray-blue, precise in a way that he had learned, across years of negotiations, to be wary of. Not hostility. Something more exact than that. Then she put herself between him and the girl with the injured arm. The movement was small, unhurried, perhaps not fully conscious, just the quiet repositioning of a body that had made a decision. She was unarmed. He was on horseback with 3 armed men, and she moved as though the arithmetic had never occurred to her. He found this, unexpectedly, interesting. He dismounted. She watched him do it without stepping back. At the height, the stillness, the face that gave her nothing to read. "The arm isn't finished," she said. Her voice was even. "I needed a moment." He stopped. I looked at her. At the half-bandaged girl? At her hands, still holding the cloth. "Then finish it," he said. She turned back to the girl without another word, and he stood in the rain and watched her work. Brennan materialized at his shoulder. One of the outriders took a branch across the shin. "The cut's been bleeding." Seelan looked at the woman. She had finished the bandage neat, firm, exactly the right tension, and was tying it off with the small knot a field surgeon would have used. Ask her, he said. Would you? Yes, she said, still nodding. Show me. The outrider bore the examination with the stoic discomfort of a man unaccustomed to being tended by strangers. The cut was longer than reported, nearly the full length of the shin, deep, needing both cleaning and binding. The woman did both with materials from a cloth satchel, her movements unhurried and certain. Seelan stood close, closer than necessary. He was aware of it. He did not step back. When she finished and rose, one hand on her knee to push herself upright, she turned directly into the space he occupied, and her hand landed on his briefly, before she registered him and pulled back. One breath. That was all. He had not moved his hand. She looked up at him the first time she had looked directly at him since the clearing. Up close, the quality in her eyes was more apparent. Not calculation, exactly. The careful attention of someone who had learned that information was more valuable than reaction. Her hair was plastered flat against her cheeks. A streak of mud along her jaw that she didn't appear to know was there. Her dress was ruined beyond all recovery. She stood straight inside it. Your horse, she said, remarkably steady. I rode him out of Ashvale. I owe you an explanation. You owe me a great deal more than that, he said. But the edge he'd intended was not quite where he'd put it. She met this without flinching. Then I'll repay what I can. I am Isolde of Ashvale. My father arranged my betrothal to Lord Aldrich Vane without my consent, and without any intention of obtaining it. I left before the ceremony. I didn't choose your horse. He was the only animal in the stables who wasn't afraid, and I needed to go somewhere. He said nothing. She didn't fill the silence. Most people filled silence, especially with him, especially when they were afraid. A brother named Aldwyn told me that Knox had chosen me. I don't know what that means. I know it's not my choice to make. I'm returning him. She held out the reins. He took them, but his eyes didn't leave her face. Where will you go? I hadn't decided yet. He looked at the girl with the bandaged arm, at Knox, who had turned his head to observe Isolde with the same patient gravity as always, but differently now. Settled. Like a thing that had been waiting and had finished waiting. Seelan turned back to the woman in the ruined white dress. Come north with us, he said. Until you know. The rain came down steady and gray around them, and from the trees to the left, Dorian very quietly cleared his throat. The other girl as well, Seelan added. Obviously. He pulled his riding cloak from his shoulders and held it out. She didn't reach for it immediately. Her eyes went to it, and then back to him with the flicker of someone working through a situation they hadn't anticipated. Then she took it, and he felt the brief warmth of her fingers against his before she stepped back. He turned back to his horse before his expression could decide what it was doing. The fire was the first dry thing Isolde had felt in hours. She sat near enough to feel its heat against her face, and far enough to maintain the pretense that she was merely a woman drying off, not someone clinging to warmth like a drowning person to timber. Mira had been given dry clothes from the packs, and was sitting across the fire with a cup of something hot, wearing the expression of a woman who had suspended judgment in favor of survival. The Alphaking of the Northern Alliance sat 2 feet to Isolde's right, and was not, as far as she could tell, cold at all. He had delivered his terms with the flat economy of a man accustomed to agreements, where the terms were the entire content. You stay under my protection. You accept my escort. You make no decisions about your future while traveling in my territory without informing me first. He had looked at her steadily the whole time, like a man laying down a contract he expected to be reviewed rather than resented. She had agreed. The terms were reasonable. More importantly, they were specific, and specificity, in her experience, was the only real protection. Dorian, younger than his brother by 4 years and considerably more cheerful by disposition, was sitting on a log with the comfortable ownership of someone who did not intend to vacate it. He had spent the first half-hour of camp asking Isolde questions with an attention she had initially read as flirtation before revising to something more deliberate. "You have medical training," he said. "Self-taught, my grandmother's books mostly." She kept her voice even. "The court physician at Ashvale wouldn't teach women." "But you learned anyway." "I found his library unlocked one winter when he was ill." A pause. The irony was not lost on me. Something crossed Dorian's face, genuine, quick, a flash of real appreciation. He glanced sideways at his brother, and then back with a slightly different quality of attention. Less interrogative. More like a man who had found the answer he was looking for. "The grey wood north of here," she said, "runs parallel to the old border road for 4 miles before it veers east. The bridge at the Veld tributary is sound. I crossed it twice as a child on my father's trading runs. If you're riding for Dark Hollow proper, it's faster than the main road by half a day." Silence. Both brothers were looking at her. Brennan, on the other side of the fire, was making a quiet internal revision. Old Gareth was looking at the fire with an attention that was not about the fire. "How do you know the border road?" Seelan said. "My grandmother believed in knowing your terrain. She said the only people who got lost were the ones who assumed someone else was keeping track." The fire crackled. The pine resin sent sparks upward into the dark. Mira performed invisibility for a while longer, then announced her intention to sleep, and withdrew with the determination of someone removing themselves from a complex situation, which left Isolde in the firelight, and the king 2 feet to her right and the knight pressing close. "I'll take the first watch," she said. "I don't sleep much," he said. Not a contradiction. She understood. He was telling her he would be awake regardless. She was not required to perform vigilance on his behalf. She settled back. The fire quieted between them. Slowly, she became aware that she was not uncomfortable. This was surprising enough that she examined it. She had expected discomfort, the particular tight anxiety of proximity to power that had not yet declared its intentions. But the man beside her had declared his intentions in a list of 3 numbered points and had not deviated from them, and there was something about the predictability of someone who did what they said, that her body recognized as safe even while her mind maintained appropriate wariness. "After a long time, do you always travel with your brother?" "No." "Then why tonight?" A silence long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he wanted to see who the horse chose. "And?" The fire popped. "Ask him yourself," he said. She looked at him the first time she had studied him properly, by firelight, without the urgency of bandaging or the distraction of negotiation. He was looking at the fire. Profile sharp in the dark jaw set, his grey eyes rendered nearly amber by the light. The kind of face that gave nothing away, not because nothing was there, but because the discipline over it was very old and very thorough. She felt, somewhere between her ribs, the small specific discomfort of a thing she preferred not to name. She looked back at the fire. "Have you ever been lonely?" she said, not quite meaning to ask, "in your own palace?" The silence stretched. Long enough to be a refusal. Long enough to be something else. "Always," he said. One word. She felt the weight of it settle into the air between them, not as confession but as a statement, the way a man names a permanent condition rather than a passing mood. Neither of them said anything more. But when she finally slept, hours later, she noticed that the distance between them on the log had somehow become smaller. The road north unfolded over days, gray mornings and pale afternoons, the forest opening occasionally to reveal the high white teeth of the northern peaks, streams running fast and cold over dark stone. Isolde had begun, without quite planning to pay attention to things. The way Seelan rode controlled and economic, no wasted motion, horse and rider so precisely calibrated that the communication between them was invisible. The way he listened in the evenings when Brennan and Gareth reported. Still, already 10 steps ahead of the information and waiting patiently for it to catch up. The way he had, twice now, quietly corrected one of his own prior assessments in front of her, without the slight hardening she was accustomed to seeing in men who had been wrong. He does that, Dorian confirmed, on the third day. He's irritatingly consistent about it. The council finds it deeply unsettling. Why? Because men who never admit errors are easy to predict. If Seelan admits he was wrong, he expects the same in return, and that a tilt of the head makes people feel accountable. People hate feeling accountable. She filed this. The habit was returning the automatic cataloging her grandmother had instilled, the small internal map-making she had done with terrain, and now did, apparently, with people. On the fourth afternoon, Knox stumbled on a route, and she overcorrected an old habit from Asheville's flatter ground, and almost unseated herself before catching the saddle. Your weight is too far back, Seelan said. When the ground is uneven, you're compensating in the wrong direction. I know. Show me. She adjusted. It was wrong again, the subtle wrongness of muscle memory, fighting new instruction. He rode closer. She felt the shift in air pressure before she heard his horse. May I? He said. The formality she recognized as its opposite, not ceremony, but genuine inquiry. She nodded. He came alongside and slightly behind, and then his hand was on her shoulder, not gripping, just present, 2 fingers and a palm through the wool of her cloak, a compass point. Down, he said, not forward. Think of it as sinking through the saddle, not pulling away from it. She was thinking with excruciating precision about the weight of his hand. Try again. The horse moved beneath her, and she adjusted with it not correctly, but closer, the direction of correctly. Better. Really. He moved his hand. The absence of it was specific, localized a small cold spot between her shoulder blades. She kept riding. You were counting, Mira said later, very quietly walking beside her. How long his hand was there, I could tell by your breathing. Isolde said nothing. I'm not criticizing, Mira said. I'm merely observing, as a neutral party. You are not a neutral party. I'm also not wrong. He didn't move away immediately, you know. After he took his hand back, he stayed there for a moment. Isolde kept her eyes on the road. That evening, she sat away from the main fire with her map, not the Alliance map from the satchel, but her own working document, built on scraps of leather and paper as they moved. A running record of terrain and road and landmarks. She had been doing it since childhood, the need to know where she was even when she didn't know where she was going. She didn't hear him sit down beside her. She was aware of him in the way one was aware of weather, not by looking directly at it, but by the change in the quality of the air. He placed something in front of her. A plate. She had not eaten. He was looking at the map. You've been drawing this since Asheville. I need to know where I am. He read it with the attentiveness of someone who understood maps, rather than someone who was pretending to. This road, he touched the page, one finger, not touching her hand, curves east half a mile north of where you've marked it. The river took the western bank in the floods 3 years ago. You've ridden this road before. Twice, not recently. He settled back without moving away. Your grandmother taught you this? She said, Maps were the only honest record of a place. People remember what they want to. The ground doesn't. Something shifted in his expression, small, quick, a thing that arrived and was controlled before it became anything definite. He looked back at the map. They sat like that until the fire burned to coals, not speaking, the map between them, the night enormous overhead. When Gareth passed on his way to the night watch, he looked at them, at the two heads bent over the same small piece of paper, at the easy distance between them that was not quite as much distance as it had been, said nothing, and went on. Greywood Town existed because roads crossed, neither large enough to have a character of its own nor small enough to be ignorable. Isolde was 3 steps into the square when she felt, without being able to immediately explain it, that something was wrong. She had learned to trust the body's faster intelligence. By the time her conscious mind assembled the evidence, a familiar stance among the men across the square, a banner she half recognized, the innkeeper's eyes cutting sideways when they arrived, her pulse had already delivered the conclusion. Mira came to her side. "Ew. I see them." The men of Thornwall. 12 of them, which was not a coincidence. And Lord Aldrich Vane, standing in the center of the square with the self-possession of a man who had arranged this meeting and was pleased with the arrangement. He was well-dressed, handsome in the angular manner of northern lords, with eyes that moved over everything with the continuous assessment of a merchant at market. He was looking at her. "Lady Isolde," he said, pleasantly. She did not reply. Then Mira said very quietly, "He found my father." The message had come that morning, through a boy paid not to know where it came from. "The man who runs the mill at Thornwall is a guest of Lord Vane's household. His health depends on your cooperation." Isolde stood in the flat grey morning light and felt the mathematics of it settle around her. A choice of one. That was what this was. That was what it had always been. She was aware, peripherally, of Seelan's presence behind her, and to the right had been aware of it since the moment she'd felt the wrongness in the square, had felt him read the same air, and go quiet in the particular way he had. She heard Brennan, somewhere behind her left shoulder, the small metallic sound of a hand moving to a sword hilt. She stepped forward. Not a large step. Just enough to make her position clear. "Lord Vane," she said. Her voice came out even. She was surprised and grateful for this. "I will not be returning to Ashvale." "Lady Isolde." He spread his hands in the gesture of reasonableness. "I have no interest in causing distress, but the agreement between our families was made without my consent." She kept her voice level. "Under the terms of the Alliance Charter, specifically Article 4, a woman of age may contest a betrothal arrangement made without her knowledge or presence. I am contesting this one." Something moved behind his eyes, not a surprise. Reassessment. "Duh. You have a legal mind," he said. "I hadn't expected that." "You didn't ask." She felt the cold of the morning on her face, the solidity of the ground under her boots. "Release Mira's father. Today. In writing, with your seal. That is the only negotiation I'm interested in having." "And if I decline?" "Then I will ensure that the Northern Alliance High Council is made aware that a Lord of Thornwall used a civilian as a hostage to coerce a woman of Ashvale on neutral territory. That is a violation of 4 separate charter articles, if you'd like me to list them." Silence. Aldrich looked past her. She didn't need to look to know what he was seeing. She could feel it in the way the sound in the square had still. Dorian's voice came from somewhere to her left, light as always, carrying perfectly. "My brother tends not to stand like that for just anyone. Thought you should know." Aldrich looked at Dorian. At Seelan. At his 12 men. He drew out a piece of parchment, borrowed a pen, and wrote with the controlled brevity of someone making calculations. He sealed it with his ring. Isolde crossed the square and took it from his hand. She read it once. The terms were what she had demanded. "Thank you," she said without warmth. She turned back. The moment she had cleared the space between them, Myra stepped forward and Isolde felt the impact of her arms. Myra, who had not cried since they were 15, and had wept then in private for exactly 3 minutes, before composing herself, holding on, with a grip that communicated precisely the amount of relief she would never say aloud. Isolde put her arms around her and held on. After a moment she became aware of the presence that had moved to stand just behind her, not touching, not intruding, simply there, close enough to feel the warmth of it against her back, the steadiness. When Myra finally pulled away, Isolde turned. He was looking at her with an expression that was simply present, no performance of approval, no commentary, just a single slow nod, the kind that said, "I saw what you did, and I know what it cost," without requiring either of them to say so. She looked away first. Only because she needed to, for reasons she was not prepared to examine at a crossroads in Greywood, with mud on her boots and the sound of the seal breaking still in her ears. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Myra, her father's handwriting, their mill's seal pressed in familiar wax. He was home. She was smiling at the merchant. Not romantically. Celine understood this. The man was perhaps 25, traveling with a pack of dried herbs, and had apparently opened a genuine conversation with Isolde about the comparative qualities of northern versus southern feverfew. She was interested in the way she was always interested in things, with that full attention he had noticed early, and continued noticing, the way she engaged with ideas, the way a man sharpens steel, applying exactly the right pressure and caring very much about the result. The man said something. She laughed, a real one, brief and unguarded, the kind she still sometimes covered with her hand before she remembered she was allowed to have it. The wine in Celine's cup was very cold. He was aware that his hand held it with more pressure than necessary. Brennan said quietly beside him, "Are you all right, my lord?" "Fine, Audine." "You've been looking at the same point in the room for 7 minutes." "I'm thinking." Brennan had been with him for 9 years and had the dignity not to respond to this. At the far corner of the room, old Gareth raised his cup, met Celine's eyes briefly, and drank. Celine set down his cup with deliberate care, crossed the room and stopped at the table where Isolde was discussing the relative merits of dried versus fresh yarrow. She looked up. "We leave early tomorrow," he said, "before first light." "Of course," she said. He walked out. The cold air of the inn's outer corridor met him like a correction. He stood in it for a moment with his hand on the wall and acknowledged, with the grimness of a man who preferred precision to comfort, that old Gareth had been right. Had been right since the ford crossing, probably. Had been right since a clearing in the rain where a woman had stood between him and a wounded girl, and he had felt something in his chest go sideways. He had been here before. Not personally, but in his memory, watching, too young to understand what he was seeing. His father, who had been everything a northern king should be, composed, strategic, entirely capable of managing his own heart. Until the moment he wasn't. And then, in the end, in the 3 months after Celine's mother died, the king of the Northern Alliance had conducted the affairs of 7 provinces with perfect efficiency, and had not, as far as anyone knew, laughed once. 3 months. That was what love cost. Not the love itself, the ending of it. The door at the corridor's end opened, letting in cold air and Isolde, who stopped when she saw him. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and Celine noted with the flat internal record-keeping that was his primary defense against himself that she was wearing the grey cloak he had stopped lending to her, and she had stopped returning. "I wasn't finished with the conversation," she said. "I know. I apologize." She appeared to consider this the speed of the apology, the absence of explanation. Her expression shifted slightly. "You don't need to explain yourself to me." "I know." She moved to the wall on the opposite side of the corridor and leaned against it, drawing the cloak around her. The candle at the corridor's end sent light across her face in warm angles. There was a small scar at the left side of her jaw, barely visible, the kind you didn't notice until the light was very specific. He noticed it now. "Tell me about Ashvale," he said. "The actual terrain, not the political territory." The line of her shoulders changed slightly, fractionally, the almost imperceptible release of someone whose guard had been addressed by something they hadn't expected. She talked about Ashvale's marshlands, the winter fogs that came up from the low valleys, the way the stone roads changed texture as you moved from border to center, and you could tell where you were without landmarks if you knew what to feel through your horse's hoof. Her voice in the dark corridor was low and even, and she gestured occasionally with one hand, sketching geography in the air. He listened, and said little, and let the silence do the work it was good at. At some point in the hour that followed, without either of them announcing it, the distance between them on that corridor wall had halved. Lady Seraphine's room smelled of smoke from a fire fed with something other than wood. The woman sitting by the window was small and still, looking out at the courtyard with an expression of mild patience, as though she had been waiting and had found the waiting untroubling. She was 60, perhaps more. One eye was filmed white. The right was clear and very dark, and gave Seelin the unsettling sense, as it always did, of being looked at from behind, rather than in front. "Sit," she said. He sat. He told her about the horse, the girl from Ashvale, the road north. When he finished, she continued looking out the window for a moment. "I know," she said. "You know. I wrote to Brother Aldwin 3 months ago. I asked him to keep watch for a traveler who would come with your horse." She turned from the window. I had seen Knox leaving. Not the rider, not the face, just the horse, in motion, carrying someone, and an absence of threat. A strong absence. She folded her hands in her lap. "I see outlines, not stories. I couldn't have told you her name. I couldn't have told you when, but I knew she would not be an enemy." He processed this. "You saw it 3 months before it happened." "I see outlines, not stories." She paused. "I do not always know what I'm seeing until it arrives." "And what did you see?" Seraphine was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, only precise. "A mate bond," she said. "The kind that forms once in a generation, the kind your father had with your mother." The word arrived with the particular heaviness of something he had been not thinking about for 8 days. "And if I don't?" "It's not a contract, Seelin. It's a fact like the weather. You can shelter from it, or you can go out in it." She tilted her head. "But hear this clearly. She will leave. Once. Not because you have failed her, because she needs to choose this for herself, rather than fall into it. If she cannot choose freely, it will cost you both more than the leaving will." He sat with this. "There's something else." Her voice gentled, which meant it was going to be something he didn't want. "You are afraid. I don't say this to wound you. I say it because the fear is familiar. It's the fear of watching your father lose his bearings after your mother died. The fear of what love costs when it ends." The fire crackled. Outside the window, a rook landed on the courtyard wall and rearranged its feathers. "She may leave once," Seraphine said. "And she may come back. But only if you give her something worth coming back to, not the kingship, not the bond. You, Whatever is underneath the parts you've decided are necessary. He stood, crossed to the window, looked out at the courtyard where, 3 floors below, Knox stood in the cold with his head up, watching the gate. The thing underneath, he said, and his voice was very flat. I'm not sure anyone has asked for it in some time. Then perhaps, Seraphine said, it's time someone did. He found her in the library. The fire had burned to ember glow, and she was sitting at the reading table with a medical text, one knee drawn up, completely absorbed. She looked up when he moved the brief, assessing attention that had become familiar to him, the way she always located herself relative to everything else in the room before deciding on a response. I couldn't sleep, she said. Neither could I. He crossed to the table and sat opposite, and for a while they read in companionable silence, then kept quiet around them. He set a book on the table in front of her. She looked at the cover, leather-bound, old, the edges worn to the softness of long handling. She opened it. The maps were meticulous. The Northern Alliance in its entirety, rendered in ink lines so fine they seemed drawn with a single hair on every road, every river, every elevation mark. The kind of document that took years to compile. She turned pages slowly, and he watched her read them the way she read everything, thoroughly, with the whole of her attention. You like maps, he said. You already knew that. Yes. She looked up from the page. You remembered. I remember everything you've said. The fire had burned very low. In the near dark, her expression was difficult to read, and he had learned, in 8 days, to pay attention to the subtleties of it. The fractional shifts that meant something even when her voice stayed even. Her hands on the open page of the map had gone still. She looked back down. He watched the angle of her jaw, the barely perceptible swallow. He did not say anything more. They stayed there until the fire was cold. He chose the wrong moment. He had been warned. Dorian had found him that afternoon in the East Corridor with the directness he deployed when he had decided to stop being amusing. If you tell her about the bond before she knows what she means to you, not what she is to you, what she means, she'll go. Tell her about you first. Tell her about the bond second, or not at all. Not yet. Not at all. Not yet. He had understood this intellectually. He chose at the fire that night to do it the other way. Isolde sat across from him, her map on her knee, and he told her the truth as he knew it, the mate bond, its rarity, its recognition. He told her in the way he did most things, directly, without performance, because he had been taught that honesty was a form of respect, and he respected her. He watched her face through the telling. The first thing that moved through her was wonder. He saw the small, involuntary opening that happened when a person encountered something they hadn't expected to find beautiful. Her hands were still on the map. Her eyes in the firelight had gone very wide. Then the wonder folded under something more complicated. This is why Knox chose me, she said. Not a question. Partly. And if Knox hadn't? He should have said yes regardless. He should have said I would have found you some other way. He should have said any of the various things that were true, and that he had not yet said about maps and corridors and the way she stood in rain. He said, I can't say for certain. The wonder had closed. He saw a small, specific contraction, the careful drawing in of someone who had extended themselves and found the ground uncertain. She looked at the fire. I'm not angry with you, she said quietly. I understand you were being honest. Isolde. I think I'd like to sleep now. She stood carefully, controlling the movement of someone who had decided on a direction. She paused at Knox's stall. The horse had lifted his head. She crossed to him and placed one hand on his muzzle, one quiet moment, and said nothing. Then she walked inside. He sat with the fire for a long time. At some point Dorian sat down across from him, and for once said nothing. "I know," Seelan said. "I wasn't going to." "I know what you were going to say." The fire burned. An ember fell. "She's different from what I expected," he said, and he was not sure this was the end of the sentence or the beginning of something else. "I know," said Dorian. Seelan looked at his hands. He had been holding the map, the one she had left folded and set on the chair nearest his usual seat, as though she had placed it where she knew he'd find it. He had been holding it, without noticing, for the last hour. He opened it. She had marked the road they traveled over 9 days, every deviation, every landmark. And there, at the southern edge of the Northern Alliance, a small arrow pointing south, the town of Fernwick, marked in her careful hand. A door. Left open, just slightly. "She marked where she was going," Dorian said. "Yes. That's not an accident." "No." Seelan folded the map and put it in his coat. Fernwick in winter was the color of pewter and ash, the sky, the stone, the bare trees at the town's edge, all operating in the same narrow palette of coal. Isolde had taken a room at the only inn and spent the first evening staring at the ceiling, and the second morning discovering that Mira was not in hers. There was a note. 2 lines. "Ashvale calls you home. We will see you safely returned." She sat on the edge of the bed and read it twice, then set it down, with the deliberateness of someone who will not be rushed into panic. She knew what this was. She had been born into this particular calculus of men who believed that the people you loved were pressure points rather than people. She knew what Aldrich wanted. She knew what her father wanted, which was the same thing in different fabric. She also knew, sitting in that grey room in Fernwick with the note in her hand, that she was not the same woman who had stood before a mirror in Ashvale 12 days ago. The woman in that mirror had been measuring herself against the price men had assigned her, and had found in their arithmetic no record of herself at all. She had been the only one who wasn't afraid in those stables. She had not thought about that at the time, had noticed it only as a fact about the horse. But it was also a statement about herself, about who she had always been, underneath the standing still. The stillness had never been her. It had been the cage. And she had ridden out of it on a black horse with no plan and no provisions and a ruined white dress. And the person who had done that person had known something the woman in the mirror had not. She dressed, braided her hair, tucked her map into her cloak, and went to find Aldrich's man. He was at the tavern. She sat across from him without being invited. "Tell Lord Vane I will meet him tomorrow morning. The market square, first light, neutral ground. If Mira is harmed in any way before then," she met his eyes with the same quality of attention she had used on the Ford Road, and the crossroads, and the corridor in the crossroads, and the corridor in Dark Hollow. The attention that said, "I have already worked through every version of this conversation, and I know where each one ends. Then every detail of this situation will rearash." She did not have it in writing. She was composing it in her head. "Lady Isolde," he said carefully, "you are the daughter of a minor lord with no. I am currently traveling under the protection of Seelan Darkhollow. I mention this not as a threat, but as information you may wish to include in your calculations." She stood and left. He found her in the market square at dusk, sitting on the stone lip of the dry fountain with her map on her knee, adding new marks with the focused attention she gave to things that required precision. She heard him before she saw him, the specific weight of his step on cobblestones, which she had apparently learned somewhere in the last 12 days without choosing to. He had ridden through the night. She could tell by the dust on his coat that had not been there yesterday. She did not look up immediately. You left a mark on the map, he said. Force of habit. He stood with his hands at his sides in the gray, late light, and she allowed herself to look at him the way she hadn't, not fully since Asheville. He was not handsome in the soft romantic sense that songs describe. He was built for something more serious than beauty. The height, the width of his shoulders, the economy of how he occupied space. His eyes, which were gray in flat light, and nearly black in darkness, and had been in certain firelit moments that she was not examining, something closer to amber. Aldrich himself had not come that morning. A lawyer stood in his place. That told her everything about how the morning would go. He's old, he said. She looked back at the map. If you've come to explain the bond to me again. I haven't. She waited. I came because I wanted to. His voice was very even, not because of Knox, not because of anything Seraphine said. I've been sitting with your map for 2 days thinking about the person who drew it, and I couldn't stop. She was aware of her own breathing, of the cold air, of the dry fountain stone, cold through her cloak. The bond may be real, he said. I believe it is. But what I felt before I knew about it, that was also real. And I should have told you that first. I should have told you that the night by the fire in Greywood when you asked me if I was ever lonely, and I gave you one word because I didn't know how to give you more. I should have told you in the corridor in Dark Hollow, and by the ford, and every evening you sat beside me with that map, and I could not account for the particular quality of the Sillins bedwing. He stopped. I should have told you. I'm telling you now. Seelan. He stopped. She looked up at him, at the familiar controlled composure, the jaw, the gray eyes doing something she had not seen before, something unguarded and complicated, and very tired of being controlled. Sit down, she said. He sat on the fountain's edge beside her, and for a moment they were quiet, the town going gray around them, a cart somewhere in the distance, a child calling for another child. His father had sat like this once, he thought, beside someone worth the risk of the ending. He had understood this intellectually for years. He understood it differently now. She opened the map on her knee, turned to the last page, blank, unused, the clean surface she had been saving. She reached into her cloak and found the charcoal she always carried. She drew a small, precise X. She held the map out to him. He looked at it for a long moment. When he raised his eyes to her face, something had shifted in it. The long-practiced architecture of his expression coming apart in the way buildings did, when the ground moved beneath them. Not collapsing, but changed. The lines different, something underneath visible that hadn't been before. His hand moved to hers, not taking the map, just covering her hand where it held the page. His thumb settling into the space between her knuckles, with a certainty that did not ask permission, because it already knew the answer. Here, she said. He repeated it, so quietly it was almost not a word. Here, she said again. That's where I'm choosing to stay. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The fountain was dry. The air smelled of pine smoke from somewhere north of the square. His eyes in the last of the evening light had changed. Not gray now, not silver. Something warmer, something she had no name for. Yet the color of a man who had stopped managing his own face. She had no name for what they were now. Warmer than gray, darker than amber, the particular shade of a thing that has stopped pretending to be something else. She did not look away. She found, with a kind of quiet surprise, that she did not want to. Mira was returned before dusk. She appeared in the doorway of the inn with her chin up, and her hair disheveled, and the expression of a woman who had been inconvenienced on a profound level, and intended to discuss it at length later. The confrontation the following morning was brief, by the standards of the ones that had preceded it. Isolde stood in the pale light of the market square and recited Article 4 and Article 7 of the Alliance Charter from memory, and Aldrich's lawyer raised 2 objections, both of which she had anticipated, and accepted a sealed dismissal of the betrothal in the handwriting of a High Council notary that Seelan had apparently sent for 12 days ago, before she had asked. When Aldrich's men rode out of Fernwick, Dorian materialized from somewhere in the crowd and leaned against the wall beside her. "Well," he said, "you'll do it." "Thank you," said Isolde. "High praise." "From me, it is." He paused. He had a messenger write to the council before he even got on the horse to come here, just, in case it's relevant information. She looked at him. He smiled, something real beneath the habitual lightness, genuine warmth, the satisfaction of a brother who had been watching and hoping and had not been disappointed. She found Seelan where she had expected him, with Knox at the edge of the square, checking the horse's feet with the concentrated attention he gave to anything that required his hand. He heard her coming and straightened, and for a moment they stood looking at each other in the bright, cold morning. "Thank you," she said, "for the notary." "You didn't need him?" "No, but having him was better." He looked at her with the quality she had been cataloguing since Greywood, and still found it difficult to name. The full attention, unhurried, the sense of being read carefully and without judgment. "Come north," he said, "not as a ward or a ward of the crown or a treaty asset. Just," he stopped, started again. "There are libraries in Dark Hollow with maps that haven't been catalogued properly in 30 years. There is a great deal of empty space in a large keep." He stopped again. She waited. "Come north," he said again, more simply. Come. Behind them, Knox turned his head to look at her. Mira, leading her own horse across the square, stopped, assessed the situation with a glance, and began very deliberately inspecting her horse's left ear with enormous concentration. Isolde looked at the X on the last page of her map, at the man standing in the morning light who had carried it in his coat for 2 days and had not explained himself until she needed him to. She picked up Knox's reins. The horse stood quiet under her hands, warm and solid, that quality of waiting finished, of something that had been patient for a long time and had arrived. "Show me the libraries," she said. He exhaled one controlled, quiet breath, and something in his shoulders went a fraction lighter. Old Gareth, somewhere behind her, cleared his throat once the sound of a man who had been right about something important, and considered this sufficient. They walked out of Fernwick together, and the road north was cold and clear and very long, and she had never been less afraid of distance in her life. In the old stories of the Northern Alliance, the mate bond was described as a fire, something that arrived suddenly and burned whether you fed it or not. The scholars argued about this. Isolde of Ashvale, who became the first keeper of the Alliance's geographic record and later its chief cartographer, would have said they had it wrong. It wasn't fire. It was what happened when 2 people stood in the same rain long enough to stop pretending it wasn't there. Knox, for his part, ate well and was exceptionally pleased with himself for the rest of his days. Isolde didn't escape because she was fearless. She escaped because she finally stopped waiting for permission to be brave. She rode into the dark with no map, no plan, and a dress that wasn't even hers to ruin, and somewhere in that cold, wet, uncertain journey north, she found the one thing no betrothal contract could ever assign her: herself. And Seelan, a man who had ruled 7 provinces without once letting his guard down, met a woman who stood in the rain without flinching and felt, for the first time, that stillness could be shared rather than endured alone. This is not a story about a king choosing a wife. It's about 2 people who were both, in their own quiet ways, profoundly lost and who found each other not through grand declarations but through maps and mud and one very opinionated horse. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to stand still. If this story stayed with you, even a little, drop a in the comments. I genuinely want to know which moment hit you the hardest. And if you want more stories like this, subscribing actually means the world. It's what tells me to keep going. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Truly.